My first recent read of the video is A.E. van Vogt's The Voyage of the Space Beagle. Here's my Panther science fiction edition of it, which says it's an all-time classic space saga. And this one was published in 1950. It follows a crew aboard the Space Beagle on humanity's first real foray into the distant stars. They are on their way to the Andromeda galaxy. I think the crew is about 1,000 strong, and on the way they keep encountering various alien entities and beings and interacting with them. Each one poses a unique threat or challenge to the crew, who deal with them in each of these almost self-contained stories. This is a fix-up novel, which means it consists of previously published short stories which are stitched together into a novel. And to be honest with you, you do sort of feel that it's falling apart at the seams a little bit. It just is barely stitched together to form a coherent novel. It feels very episodic because of this. Each one of these alien encounters is its own story, but there is kind of a thread that goes through the narrative, and it's really good for the time. There's a lot of ideas in here that you think, being published in 1950 is really impressive, and there's a lot of historical value here for the genre. If you're interested in science fiction, I would recommend reading The Voyage of the Space Beagle, because you can see how it's directly influenced many other works. Famously, one of the stories in here is supposedly the inspiration for the film Alien, which you could make an argument for being the greatest science fiction film ever made, potentially even the greatest horror film ever made. And when you get to that story, I won't tell you what it is, you can definitely see the parallel and the inspiration on the Xenomorph and the Facehuggers as well. So I liked The Voyage of the Space Beagle. That title is a direct reference to The Voyage of the Beagle, which is the name of Charles Darwin's book. And it's kind of slapstick at times. I was wondering at a certain point why this crew kept allowing these dangerous alien entities aboard their ship. And the crew does make a direct reference to this, and they joke about it. So there is a comedic element to The Voyage of the Space Beagle. But if you're interested in science fiction, I think this is almost a must-read just for the historical value alone. The next book I read recently is Overlay by Barry Malzberg. I got this one as a recommendation from watching Bookpild's channel. If you don't subscribe to him already, then please go and do that. And this is an incredibly strange novel. It follows an alien being who is part of this agency, and he is tasked with overseeing the downfall of humanity as a species because they've been determined to be too unpredictable and dangerous. And the way that this agent of this agency, this alien being, goes about facilitating the downfall of humanity is to infiltrate the minds of several gamblers, these horse players, these people that bet on horse racing. And the reason for this is that these gamblers' minds are said to be the most pliable and the most easily influenced. And the way that the beings seek to undermine humanity is to break the spirit of these horse players in order to manipulate them into committing some very serious acts of extreme violence, which then will create this almost domino effect and lead to the downfall of humanity as a civilization, which sounds like an incredibly weird premise because it is. We have this alien being who's never really described physically. He's more of a psychic entity, I suppose, and he infiltrates the minds of these horse players and converses with them through kind of mental capacity. and they are slowly coerced and manipulated into taking on extremely risky bets, and you get a bit of the psychology of gambling in here. And the really interesting thing is that the alien being almost becomes caught up in this lifestyle of these horse players and starts to take on some of their traits and sensibilities and question his own sanity a little bit at times. It is extremely weird, like I say. It's probably not something I would recommend to all science fiction readers, but if you've got more of a literary interest, I do think the writing in here is really strong, and some of the psychological and philosophical questions that Overlay poses are quite good to dive into and really try and wrap your mind around. It did have me thinking quite a lot while I was reading it and afterwards as well. So not an easy one to read at times, because it does go quite in depth on the detail of horse racing and horse betting and the odds associated with that, and the nuances of these tips and these tipsters that emerge through horse racing as an industry, which can be a little bit dull. I'm not going to lie. Reading about that stuff is not always super exciting, and Malzberg did immerse himself in this lifestyle as well, so you do get a real sense of that. So not an easy one to recommend, but if you are intrigued by that definition, I would go out and grab it if you can find it, because it is only 140 pages or so you can get through it in a day or two. And last but definitely not least is Seveneves by Neal Stephenson, which is 867 pages long. In the first sentence of Seveneves, the moon explodes and shatters into the 7 enormous chunks. Scientists begin to ponder the reasons for this, and it becomes apparent that that's not the most pressing question. The most pressing question is, what are the implications and the ramifications of this event? So while the cause of the moon shattering is unknown, the scientists do figure out that these 7 chunks, and many smaller ones as well, are slowly coming together, and they're going to smash into each other and grind into smaller and smaller pieces. These pieces will then rain down on Earth, setting fire to the atmosphere for 5,000 years, making the surface completely uninhabitable. And all of this is going to happen within a 2-year time frame. So this prompts a coming together of humanity to figure out a way to continue the species. And the way that they go about doing this is to construct a series of arc ships, which are going to be launched into orbit, and they will kind of swarm around the International Space Station, where these people will stay for thousands of years before returning to Earth's surface once it becomes inhabitable again. Stephenson writes a very technical story here, where he takes you through the conception, the construction, and the operation of these arc ships in excruciating detail. He is not so focused on the large cast of characters in Seveneves as much as he is on the orbital mechanics and the science around these systems and these ships, which leads to an experience which I think, unless you're a really big fan of hard science fiction, can be really dull and really tedious. The final third of this book is really interesting. I'm not going to spoil what that is, but it takes 600 pages to get there. And even when you do get there, you still feel this detachment and this technical writing style from Stephenson, which I just didn't find too appealing or compelling myself. The most interesting thing that Seveneves does, to me, is not to explore the technical details of these arc ships or the orbital mechanics associated with these ships, but is the actions, the ideologies, and the traits of several individuals being passed down over generations, and how that can lead to differences in culture and be manipulated as well. The annoying thing about that then is that Stephenson feels the need to signpost that he's doing that. He really clearly spells that out for the reader, which I think is a real shame. So the longest science fiction book that I've ever read, I did not really enjoy that much overall. When you think about these much smaller, 200-page books that pack way more of a punch, I think time would be better spent reading those. Unless you're really interested in the hard science fiction and the technical aspects of Seveneves, then you might enjoy it. Or you're just intrigued about that story and that premise, and you want to get to that final third that I'm talking about and figure out where this story goes. I don't think the journey is particularly worth it myself, but I know there are a lot of Neal Stephenson fans out there, and a lot of people do really like Seveneves. What does come through in Seveneves, though, is that Neal Stephenson is clearly a very intelligent, very knowledgeable man, but my first impressions of him as a writer are not particularly strong. That's everything on today's video. I am going to be making more of these, so feel free to subscribe if that was of interest. I did recently publish a top 10 science fiction books that I've ever read video too, so go and check that one out if you are interested. And please subscribe, because I have recently started this channel and I'm going to be doing quite a bit more with it. So thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next one.